A quiet black teen steps into a Los Angeles courthouse, the weight of his late father's chain resting against his chest, only to have a white officer tear it from his neck with no warning. He stays silent, but what unfolds next sends a tremor through the entire courtroom. What kind of strength does it take to hold your ground when the world seems determined to break you? Let us know where you're watching from and if you've ever seen someone choose dignity over rage. Settle in, this story is one you won't forget. The Los Angeles morning sun slipped through the courthouse windows, casting long, hesitant shadows across the marble floor. 18-year-old John Carter stood just inside the entrance, his dark eyes scanning the bustling hallway. The air was thick with the hum of low voices, the shuffle of polished shoes, and the faint metallic clink of security scanners. John's pressed white shirt was crisp, his posture steady, but beneath his calm exterior, a quiet storm churned. Today wasn't just another day, it was a reckoning, though he didn't yet know how deeply it would cut. The chain, simple and gold, hung just below his collarbone, its pendant scarred from a fire that had claimed his father 5 years ago. It wasn't jewelry, it was a tether to a man who'd run into flames to save others. John touched it lightly, feeling its familiar weight, a reminder of who he was walking into this place for. The crowd around him, lawyers in sharp suits, families clutching paperwork, clerks juggling coffee and files, seemed to blur, their glances lingering on him just a moment too long. Some were curious, others wary, as if his presence demanded explanation. Then, without warning, Officer Thomas Reed emerged from the crowd. His boots struck the floor with purpose, his broad frame cutting through the hallway like a blade. His eyes locked onto John, not with recognition but with intent. Before John could react, Reed's hand shot forward, yanking the chain from his neck with a brutal tug. The clasp snapped, the sound sharp against the hallway's murmur. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A woman froze mid-step. A man in a suit looked away. John's hand rose to his throat, the sting of torn skin burning, but his face remained still, his silence louder than any protest. Reed held the chain aloft, letting it dangle like a prize. "Looks stolen," he said, loud enough for the hallway to hear, his voice coated in disdain. The words landed like a slap, but John didn't flinch. Inside, his heart thudded, not with fear, but with something fiercer, a resolve to stand taller than the moment trying to shrink him. The crowd's eyes shifted, some meeting his briefly before darting away, their silence a heavier weight than Reed's cruelty. This wasn't just about a chain. It was about a boy, a memory, and a system that saw neither. What happened next would shake the room to its core, but in that moment John Carter stood alone, his father's chain gone, but its strength still burning in his chest. The story was just beginning, and the world was about to see what dignity could do. The Los Angeles dawn crept through the blinds of the Carter house, its light pale and cautious, as if reluctant to stir the stillness within. 18-year-old John Carter stood before a cracked bedroom mirror, buttoning a white shirt with slow, deliberate hands. Not out of fear, not exactly, but because some mornings carried a weight that demanded care. This was one of them. His dark eyes traced the reflection of his own face, sharper now than it had been a year ago, holding a quiet intensity most people missed. He didn't rush. His grandfather, Abraham, had taught him that. Clean lines, calm steps, eyes forward. Today was court. A routine appearance, his lawyer had called it, over a mix-up involving a vandalized school locker and a name miswritten in a report. But June knew routine didn't always mean simple. Not when you were a black boy walking into a Los Angeles courthouse. He smoothed his shirt, tucked neatly into dark jeans, nothing loud or flashy, just enough to show he respected the gravity of where he was headed. Then he reached for the one thing he never left behind. A gold chain, simple, slightly warped, its pendant bearing scars from a fire that had taken his father, Michael Carter, 5 years earlier. Michael had been a firefighter, the kind of man who ran toward danger when others fled. He'd died pulling 3 children from a collapsing apartment building, the flames too fierce for even his courage. They found the chain in the wreckage, blackened and fused to a shred of his uniform, the only piece of him that survived. Abraham had cleaned it with oil and a soft brush, reshaping its curve with hands that trembled only slightly. This didn't break, he'd told John. Voice rough but steady, "Neither will you." Jean ran his thumb across the pendant now, its edges smooth but etched with faint scars, like the memory of his father. He didn't wear it for pride or style. He wore it to feel something solid when the world felt unsteady, to carry a piece of Michael's strength against his chest. As he fastened the clasp, the familiar weight settled just below his collarbone, and he exhaled softly. In the mirror he saw more than himself. Taller now, quieter than people expected, holding more inside than anyone could guess. A memory flickered. John, barely 13, sitting on the porch with Michael after a long shift. "Life's gonna test you, son," his father had said, his voice warm but firm, the chain glinting at his neck. "It'll try to make you small. Don't let it. Stand tall even when it hurts." John had nodded, not fully understanding then. Now, standing in his room, the words felt like a vow he was still learning to keep. From the hallway came the soft tap of a cane, steady as a heartbeat, followed by a voice roughened by age but unwavering. "You ready, John?" Abraham Carter, 76, stood in the doorway, his fedora tilted just so, his leathery hands gripping the cane with quiet strength. His eyes, sharp despite the years, held a question deeper than the words. John nodded, but the truth was more complex. He wasn't just preparing for court. He was preparing to carry his father into a room where he might be seen only as a defendant. The chain felt heavier now, not from its weight, but from what it meant. He glanced at Abraham, whose face held no fear, only a resolve carved by decades of battles John could only imagine. "Yeah," John said softly, meeting his grandfather's gaze. "I'm ready." But inside he hoped, wherever Michael was, that he'd understand. John wasn't walking into that courthouse to be heard. He was walking in to be remembered. The old sedan rolled down Sunset Boulevard, its engine humming softly in the Los Angeles winter morning. The heater buzzed low, just enough to keep the frost from creeping across the windows. Outside, the city wore its usual gray veil, palm trees swaying lazily, sidewalks heavy with early commuters, and a chill that slipped into your bones if you lingered too long. John Carter, 18, sat in the passenger seat, his posture straight, his face unreadable. The gold chain, scarred from his father's last fire, rested beneath his collar, close to his heart. Behind the wheel, Abraham Carter, 76, drove with quiet precision, his fedora tilted just so, his leathery hands gripping the wheel like they'd held far heavier burdens. Silence filled the car, but it wasn't empty. With John and Abraham, silence was a language, a shared understanding built over years of loss and resilience. The city blurred past, neon signs dimmed by dawn, a jogger in a bright hoodie, a street vendor setting up his cart. John's eyes traced the horizon, but his mind was elsewhere, tethered to the chain and the man it had belonged to. He wondered if his father, Michael, had ever felt this weight, not just of a courthouse, but of a world that seemed to demand you prove your place in it. Abraham cleared his throat, breaking the quiet. "You know," he said, eyes fixed on the road. "First time I walked into a courthouse, I was 19. Los Angeles, 1969. Didn't even get through the door before they had me face down on the pavement. Said I looked like someone they wanted." John's jaw tightened slightly, but he stayed silent. "Held me 9 hours," Abraham continued, his voice steady but laced with old scars. "No charges, no report. Just let me go like I was nothing. Changed their mind about roughing me up." He paused, then added, "You'd think things would have shifted by now." John glanced over. "Have they?" Abraham's dry laugh carried the weight of decades. "You're about to find out." The courthouse loomed ahead, a fortress of glass and stone, its flags stiff in the morning breeze. Uniformed officers stood at the entrance, their eyes scanning the crowd with practiced indifference. John felt a shift in his chest, that tightening that came not from the law but from the eyes that would follow him inside. A woman crossing the street clutched her bag tighter as they passed. A man in a suit glanced up, then away, as if John's presence was a question he didn't want to answer. Abraham turned into a parking spot and cut the engine. He turned to John, his gaze steady. "We don't bow today," he said, voice low but firm. "We walk in, head high. That's our fight." John nodded, not agreement but understanding. They stepped out, Abraham's cane tapping rhythmically against the asphalt, a sound older than the city itself. John walked beside him, shoulders squared, the chain a quiet anchor against his skin. He wasn't just heading to court, he was carrying his father, his grandfather, and every unspoken lesson they'd left him. The city watched, but John kept his eyes forward, ready to face whatever waited inside. The Los Angeles courthouse rose like a monolith against the pale morning sky, its glass facade reflecting the city's restless pulse. John Carter, 18, stepped out of the sedan, his breath visible in the crisp air. The gold chain, scarred from his father's final fire, rested warm beneath his collar, a silent anchor. Beside him, Abraham Carter, 76, moved with measured purpose, his cane tapping the pavement in a steady rhythm, each strike a defiance older than the stone steps ahead. The building wasn't just tall, it was imposing, its message clear: power lived here, and it wasn't theirs to claim. As they approached the entrance, John felt the weight of eyes. Not everyone stared, but enough did. A security officer at the metal detector glanced up, his gaze lingering on John's pressed white shirt, his quiet posture, as if searching for something out of place. A woman in a tailored coat stepped slightly to the side, her heels clicking faster as she passed. A man on the steps, phone in hand, looked up briefly, then away, dismissing John's presence with practiced ease. It wasn't hostility. Not always. It was something subtler, a quiet demand to shrink, to soften, to apologize for existing. John's chest tightened, but his face stayed calm, his steps even. Abraham's cane kept its rhythm, tap, 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 like a heartbeat grounding them both. John glanced at his grandfather, whose fedora sat low, eyes sharp and unyielding. A memory surfaced. Years ago, Abraham sitting on their porch telling John about the first time he'd faced a badge. "They'll try to make you feel small," he'd said, his voice low, "but you're bigger than their eyes can see. Walk like you know it." John hadn't understood then, but now, with the courthouse doors looming, those words felt like armor. Inside, the lobby was a cavern of marble and echoes. The air carried the sharp scent of floor polish and stale coffee. People moved in clusters. Lawyers with briefcases, families whispering, clerks weaving through the crowd. John and Abraham navigated the security line, the scanner's beep cutting through the hum. An officer waved John through, but his eyes followed, tracing the line of John's shoulders, the faint glint of the chain peeking from his collar. John kept his head high, but he felt it, the invisible weight that settled when you were black and walking where judgment waited. They reached the escalator to the upper floors, the courthouse's grandeur growing colder with each step. A young woman ahead of them adjusted her purse, her fingers tightening as she glanced back. John caught her eye for a moment and she looked away, her face a mix of discomfort and apology. He didn't react, but inside something twisted, a quiet ache, not for her, but for the world that made her look at him that way. Abraham paused at the top of the escalator, his cane planted firmly. "You feel that?" he asked, his voice low, not turning his head. John nodded. "Yeah, I feel it. The weight, the eyes, the unspoken rules pressing down." "Good," Abraham said, his tone steady as stone. "Now walk through it." And so they did, John's steps matching the rhythm of Abraham's cane, not because they expected fairness, but because showing up, refusing to flinch, was a kind of justice in itself. The hallway to courtroom 3A waited, and with it, a moment neither could yet foresee. The hallway outside courtroom 3A in the Los Angeles courthouse was colder than it should have been, not just from the polished tile floors or the draft slipping through aging vents. It was a deeper chill, woven from decades of whispered arguments, hurried verdicts, and unspoken tensions that clung to the walls like froth. John Carter, 18, sat on a long wooden bench, his back straight, hands folded neatly in his lap. The gold chain, scarred from his father's final fire, rested warm against his skin, its weight a quiet reminder of why he was here. Beside him, Abraham Carter, 76, sat motionless, his cane between his knees, fedora low, eyes sharp as ever. They didn't speak, but Abraham noticed everything. The hallway buzzed with muted sounds, low voices, the squeak of dress shoes, the distant cry of a child. John felt the eyes, not all at once, but in fleeting glances. A man in a gray suit looked up from his phone, his gaze lingering on John before snapping back to the screen, too quick to be casual. A woman in heels crossed the hall, her purse clutched tighter as she passed, her steps quickening. Even the janitor, pushing a mop near the elevator, paused just a moment too long when John met his eye. It wasn't always hostility, sometimes it was just unease, the kind that came when someone didn't fit the expected frame. Too young, too tall, too serious, too black. John had learned to read those looks. They asked, what did he do? Or worse, who is he here for? Inside, Jahan's chest tightened, but his face stayed calm, his body still. He remembered Abraham's words from years ago, spoken over coffee at their kitchen table. They'll look at you and see what they want to see. Don't give them the satisfaction of proving them right. The memory steadied him, but the weight of the hallway pressed harder. Abraham shifted slightly, his fingers tapping once on his cane, a subtle signal, a code passed through generations. Stay sharp. Then the air shifted. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, echoed down the hall, not rushed, but purposeful, like a drumbeat announcing trouble. John looked up. Officer Thomas Reed emerged from around the corner, broad-shouldered, his deputy uniform crisp, boots polished to a mirror shine. His belt was heavy with gear, his jaw tight, his eyes scanning the hallway like a predator choosing a mark. When they landed on John, the air thickened. Reed didn't smile, didn't speak, just stared, long enough to send a message without words. You don't belong. John didn't flinch, but something in his chest coiled tighter. Reed's gaze dropped to the faint glint of the chain peeking from John's collar. His lips twitched, not quite a smirk, but close. He moved closer, each step deliberate, his presence shrinking the hallway. The crowd seemed to fade, lawyers, clerks, families, all swallowed by the tension radiating from Reed's approach. A mother with a toddler shifted her child to the other hip, her eyes darting away. A lawyer scrolling through emails slowed, his thumb hovering over the screen. Reed stopped 2 feet from John, his posture rigid, chin tilted with an authority that felt more personal than professional. You waiting on something? He asked, his voice flat but edged with challenge. John met his gaze, steady and clear. My hearing, he said, his tone calm, betraying none of the storm inside. Reed's eyes narrowed, dropping again to the chain. That chain, he said, the words dripping with disdain. You steal that, boy? The word boy landed like a stone, sharp and sour. John's jaw tightened, but he took a slow breath. It was my father's, he said. A firefighter, died in a house fire 5 years ago. Reed leaned in slightly, his voice lowering. A firefighter, he repeated, skeptical, as if the idea offended him. That chain looks too expensive for someone like you. The pause that followed was a dare, a test to see if John would rise to the bait. John didn't. He sat still, letting silence speak louder than anger. Reed's jaw twitched, his fingers brushing the edge of his belt, clearly unsatisfied with John's restraint. Abraham shifted again, his cane tapping once, sharper this time. His eyes locked on Reed, unyielding. He earned that chain more than you'll ever know, he said, his voice low and graveled, cutting through the hallway's hum. Reed turned slowly, his face tightening. You got a problem, sir? He asked, his tone clipped. I do, Abraham said, standing now, slow but firm, his cane planted like a root. But it ain't worth discussing with someone who sees a boy's grief and calls it theft. The words hung heavy, drawing a few heads, whispers starting, eyes flickering toward the scene. Reed exhaled sharply, part frustration, part restraint, but he didn't back down. Naya. John sat still, the chain burning hotter against his chest. Something had shifted. The hallway wasn't just a waiting space anymore, it was a stage, and Reed had just made the chain a target. The hallway outside courtroom 3A held its breath, the air heavy with the weight of unspoken rules and fleeting glances. John Carter, 18, sat rigid on the wooden bench, his hands still folded, the gold chain scarred from his father's final fire, burning warm against his chest. Abraham Carter, 76, sat beside him, his cane a silent sentinel, his eyes fixed on Officer Thomas Reed, who stood 2 feet away, his words still echoing, that chain looks too expensive for someone like you. The hallway's hum, whispers, footsteps, the clatter of a clerk's papers, faded, as Reed's challenge hung like a blade. Jean's heart thudded, not with fear but with a deeper ache, a violation he couldn't yet name. He kept his gaze steady, refusing to give Reed the reaction he craved, but inside a memory surged. 5 years ago, the day they'd found the chain in the wreckage of that Los Angeles fire. Abraham had held it out to him, blackened and warped, his voice rough with grief. "Your father wore this when he saved those kids. It's yours now. Don't let anyone take it." Jean had been 13, too young to understand its weight. Now, with Reed's eyes boring into him, that weight felt like a vow. Reed's boots struck the tile again, slower this time, circling back like a hawk eyeing prey. The crowd sensed it. A mother with a toddler froze, her eyes darting to the floor. A lawyer across the hall clutched his briefcase tighter, his face a mask of discomfort. Reed stopped directly in front of John, his shadow falling over the bench. Without warning, his hand shot forward, not to Jean's arm or bag, but to the chain. With one brutal tug he yanked it from Jean's neck. The clasp snapped, the sound a sharp crack in the hallway's stifled air. The chain tore free, leaving a raw red mark on Jean's throat. The hallway gasped. A woman in a blue coat let out a soft "oh," then covered her mouth. The janitor near the elevator stopped mopping, his hands tightening on the handle. Even the bailiff, standing near the courtroom door, flinched, his eyes flickering with unease. John froze, the sting at his neck like fire, but the pain was only part of it. The true violation was in Reed's hand, where the chain dangled like a trophy, its scarred pendant swinging lazily. "Looks stolen to me," Reed said, loud enough for the hallway to hear, his voice thick with arrogance. John's hand rose slowly to his neck, fingers brushing the raw skin. His chest burned, not just with anger, but with the sheer wrongness of it. His father's memory reduced to a stranger's taunt. He wanted to speak, to demand the chain back, but Abraham's lessons held him still. Don't let them pull you into their game. Stay steady. So he did, his face a mask of calm, though his heart roared. Abraham was on his feet now, faster than his age should allow, his cane tapping like a war drum. "You just stole from a child," he said, his voice low, hoarse, and dangerous, each word cutting through the hallway's stunned silence. "In a courthouse, no less." His eyes locked on Reed's, unyielding, like stone against steel. The crowd shifted. A paralegal glanced up from her phone, her fingers hovering. A man in a suit cleared his throat, then looked away, as if the moment was too raw to witness. Reed didn't flinch. He turned to Abraham, still holding the chain, his lips curling into a half-smirk. "If it's his, he'll get it back," he said, shrugging. "I'll log it as evidence." The word evidence hit John like a slap, as if his father's sacrifice, his family's grief, had been reduced to a line in a report. Reed turned toward the courtroom door, the chain still in his fist, his boots striking the tile with deliberate force. John stood now, his movements slow but deliberate, his eyes never leaving the chain. The hallway remained still, the silence not neutral but complicit. No one intervened. The bailiff's gaze dropped to the floor. The lawyer across the hall resumed scrolling, as if nothing had happened. The woman in the blue coat whispered something to her companion, her voice too low to catch. John felt it all, their avoidance, their discomfort, their choice to let this pass. It wasn't just the chain Reed had taken. It was dignity, stripped in a place meant to uphold it. Abraham's hand rested gently on John's shoulder, his voice barely above a whisper. "You all right, son?" John nodded, but the truth was, he wasn't, not really. Something sacred had been torn away, and the hallway's silence had let it happen. The allure too, but, inside Joan's resolve grew. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The heavy wooden door to courtroom 3A creaked open, its sound slicing through the tense hush of the Los Angeles courthouse hallway. "John Carter," the bailiff's voice called, firm but neutral, echoing off the tile. John, 18, rose from the bench, his white shirt still crisp, despite the raw sting at his neck where Officer Thomas Reed had ripped away his father's gold chain moments ago. His heart thudded louder than he wanted, each beat a mix of anger and resolve. Abraham Carter, 76, gave him a single nod, silent and steady, his cane resting against the bench. The nod said, "I'm here, walk tall." John took a breath and stepped toward the door, the weight of the hallway's eyes trailing him. Inside, the courtroom was colder than the hallway, not in temperature but in spirit. Sterile fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a flat, unforgiving glow over polished wooden benches and a high judge's bench that loomed like a throne. The gallery was half filled, lawyers adjusting papers, a few onlookers whispering, their faces a mix of curiosity and disinterest. John felt their glances, some fleeting, some lingering. As he followed the bailiff to the defense table, the air smelled of old wood and faint traces of cleaning solution, a sterile contrast to the chaos still burning in his chest. Officer Reed was already inside, standing near the prosecution's table, his posture casual, almost arrogant. The chain, John's chain, dangled from his hand, its scarred pendant catching the light in a way that felt wrong, like a sacred thing profaned. Reed leaned toward the young prosecutor beside him, muttering, "Looks like something from a back-alley pawn shop." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried, deliberate and sharp. The prosecutor's face tightened, his eyes fixed forward, as if trying to distance himself from the moment. John's jaw clenched, but he sat at the defense table, his hands steady despite the storm inside. His lawyer, a woman in her early 30s with a sharp blazer and tired eyes, leaned in. "You okay?" she whispered, her voice soft but urgent. John nodded, but the answer wasn't true. The sting at his neck pulsed. A physical value of his father's sacrifice now hung in a stranger's hand, mocked in a room meant to uphold justice. John wanted to stand, to speak, to demand the chain back, but Abraham's voice echoed in his mind, "Stay still, stay steady. Let the truth walk with you." So he sat, his gaze fixed on the chain, its faint glint a reminder of what he'd lost and what he refused to let go. The gallery shifted suddenly. A woman in the third row whispered to her neighbor, her eyes darting to Jean then away. A man in a suit coughed, his discomfort palpable. Jean felt their judgment, their assumptions, but also their silence. They'd seen Reed's act in the hallway or heard the whispers, yet no one spoke. The silence wasn't neutral. It was heavy, complicit, a weight John had carried before, but never like this. A memory flickered. His father, Michael, sitting with him after a schoolyard fight, the chain glinting at his neck. "They'll try to break you, John," he'd said. "Not with fists, but with looks, words, silence. Don't let them. You're stronger than that." John had nodded, young and unsure. Now, in this courtroom, those words felt like a lifeline. The bailiff stood taller, his voice cutting through the room. "All rise." The gallery shuffled to its feet as the side door near the judge's bench creaked open. John turned, his breath catching. The figure stepping through moved with quiet authority, robe flowing, posture unshaken. The light caught behind them, obscuring their face, but something in their walk, deliberate, unhurried, stirred a flicker of recognition in John. He couldn't place it, not yet, but the room seemed to hold its breath, sensing a shift. The truth was coming, and it would not be silent. The courtroom in the Los Angeles courthouse was a crucible of silence, its sterile lights humming faintly, casting stark shadows across the polished benches. John Carter, 18, sat at the defense table, the sting at his neck still raw from where Officer Thomas Reed had torn away his father's gold chain. The chain dangled in Reed's hand near the prosecution's table, its scarred pendant glinting under the harsh fluorescence. A mockery of the memory it held. John's chest tightened, his calm exterior masking a storm of grief and defiance. The gallery watched, their whispers hushed, their eyes flickering between curiosity and unease. No one spoke of the hallway incident, but its weight lingered, heavy as the air before a storm. The side door near the judge's bench creaked open, and the bailiff's voice rang out, "All rise." The room stood, the shuffle of feet and rustle of papers filling the space. John rose, his posture steady, though his heart beat faster, a rhythm of anticipation he couldn't name. A figure stepped through the door, robed in black, moving with a quiet authority that didn't demand attention but commanded it. The light caught behind her, blurring her features, but her walk, deliberate, unshaken, stirred something in John. A flicker of recognition, faint but undeniable, like a memory half remembered. Judge Sarah Carter took her seat at the bench, her presence shifting the room's gravity. Her robe settled around her like a mantle, her hands resting calmly, fingers interlaced with a stillness that felt unbreakable. Her eyes, sharp and measured, swept the courtroom, taking in every face, Reed's casual arrogance, the prosecutor's taut silence, the gallery's restless energy. For a fleeting moment, her gaze landed on Joan, and something passed between them, too brief to define. Was it recognition? Pride? Joan couldn't be sure, but it steadied him like a hand on his shoulder. A memory surfaced. Joan, 10 years old, sitting at the kitchen table while his mother, Sarah, helped him with homework. The chain hung at his father's neck across the room, glinting as Michael laughed. "You've got your mother's fight in you," Sarah had said, her voice soft but firm. "But you've got to learn when to use it." John hadn't understood then, but now, in this courtroom, her presence felt like the answer to that lesson. Sarah's voice cut through the room, even and controlled. "This court is now in session." It wasn't loud, but it carried a weight sharper than any gavel, silencing the gallery's murmurs. The prosecutor straightened, his pen still. Reed shifted, the chain in his hand suddenly seeming heavier. John felt the room hold its breath, as if sensing what he did. A shift, subtle but seismic, like the first crack in a dam. The gallery leaned forward slightly. A woman in the second row clutched her purse, her eyes fixed on Sarah. A man in a tie scribbled notes, his pen pausing as if caught by her presence. John's heart thudded, not from fear but from something new, something alive. Sarah's calm wasn't just authority, it was a promise. The chain, his father's memory, was still in the wrong hands, but the woman at the bench held a power that Reed couldn't touch. The room was still, but it wasn't quiet. It was the stillness before thunder, before something broke open that could never be put back. The Los Angeles courtroom was a taut wire, its sterile air charged with the weight of what had just happened in the hallway and the silent anticipation of what was to come. John Carter, 18, sat at the defense table, his neck still stinging from where Officer Thomas Reed had ripped away his father's gold chain. The chain dangled in Reed's gloved hand near the prosecution's table, its scarred pendant swaying like a pendulum of arrogance. John's heart pounded, a mix of grief and defiance, but his face remained steady, his hands folded, refusing to give Reed the satisfaction of a reaction. The gallery watched, their whispers stilled, their eyes flickering between June, Reed, and the judge's bench, where Judge Sarah Carter sat, her presence a quiet storm. Sarah's hands rested on the bench, fingers interlaced, her robe a dark curtain of authority. Her eyes, sharp and unyielding, scanned the room with a precision that missed nothing. Reed's casual defiance, the prosecutor's tense silence, the gallery's uneasy curiosity. The hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to fade, the room holding its breath as Reed stepped forward, the chain glinting in his hand. "For the record, Your Honor," he said, clearing his throat, his voice loud enough to carry, "the defendant was wearing what appeared to be stolen property. I confiscated it as possible evidence." He let the chain swing slightly, drawing every eye in the room, a deliberate show of power. John's chest tightened, the word evidence landing like a blow. His father's sacrifice, reduced to a prop in Reed's hand. A memory flashed. Sarah, years ago, tucking him into bed after his father's funeral, her voice soft but fierce. "Your father's chain isn't just gold, John. It's his heart, still beating for you. Don't let anyone take that from you." Now that heart was in Reed's fist, and John fought the urge to stand, to speak, to reclaim it. Sarah's gaze fixed on Reed, even and controlled. "Was the defendant under arrest when you seized this item?" she asked, her voice calm but cutting. Reed hesitated, just a beat. "No, ma'am." "Was he posing a threat to anyone in the building?" "No, Your Honor." "Did you have a warrant for seizure?" "No, ma'am." "Did you file a formal report after confiscating it?" "Not yet," Reed said, his tone clipped. "I intended to." Sarah raised a hand, and Reed's words stopped mid-breath. Her fingers lowered slowly, as if adjusting the weight of the entire courtroom. "You took property from a minor," she said, her voice steady, "in a federal courthouse, without probable cause, without a warrant, and without filing a report." Reed stiffened, his confidence faltering. The gallery shifted. A woman in the second row gasped softly, her hand rising to her mouth. A man in a suit leaned forward, his pen frozen above his notepad. Sarah leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving Reed. "You didn't question him. You didn't verify anything. You made an assumption." The word hung heavy, sharp as a blade. "You humiliated that boy without cause." She paused, letting the silence stretch, letting the room feel the weight of what was coming. Then, calmly, unapologetically, she said, "And that boy is my son." The room shattered. A gasp rippled through the gallery, loud and unrestrained. "No way," someone muttered. The court reporter's fingers missed a keystroke, the clack of her machine faltering. The prosecutor's pen hovered, his eyes wide, caught off guard. Reed froze, his jaw tensing, the chain in his hand suddenly awkward, wrong. For one perfect second, his arrogance drained away, his face a cracked mask. John turned slowly toward the bench, his breath catching. It was like seeing her for the first time. His mother, Judge Sarah Carter, the woman who'd packed his lunches, mended his scraped knees, taught him to argue with grace, not anger. She didn't look at him now. Her eyes stayed on Reed, steady as stone. "You didn't see a child wearing a memory," she continued, her voice unwavering. "You saw a threat. You didn't see a grieving son. You saw a problem." Reed's mouth opened, but no sound came. "What you did wasn't protocol. It was prejudice, dressed in authority, wrapped in arrogance." The gallery murmured now, a low current of awe and disbelief. A woman in the third row whispered, "She said it," her voice trembling with quiet admiration. John stood straighter, not from pride but from truth. Someone had finally named what he'd carried in silence, and the room had heard it. Sarah leaned back, her robe shifting like a tide. "The chain you're holding was worn by a man who died saving others," she said, her voice soft but ironclad. "And now it's being used to shame his son." The word son lingered, a punctuation of love and fury. Reed lowered the chain slightly, as if it burned his palm. The gallery's whispers grew. A man in the back nodded, his jaw tight. A young woman clutched her friend's arm, her eyes wide. Jean felt it, the shift in the room, the truth breaking through the silence that had held him down. His mother's voice wasn't just justice, it was a shield, forged from years of love and loss, now wielded for him. The Los Angeles courtroom held a stillness so dense it seemed to press against the walls, the weight of Judge Sarah Carter's words, and "that boy is my son," still rippling through the air. Jean Carter, 18, stood at the defense table, his heart a steady drum of relief and pride, the sting at his neck a fading echo of Officer Thomas Reed's violation. Reed stood near the prosecution's table, the gold chain, John's father's scarred relic, still in his gloved hand, but its sway had stopped, as if it sensed the shift in the room. The gallery was silent but alive, their eyes fixed on Sarah, whose calm authority burned brighter than the sterile lights above. Sarah leaned back slightly, her robe settling like a curtain of gravity, her hands still interlaced, unyielding. Her voice, when it came, was calm, but cut deeper than a shout. "Return the chain." Reed didn't move at first, his jaw tight, his confidence fractured. Sarah's eyes didn't blink, her presence a wall he couldn't breach. "Now," she added, the single word heavy with finality. Reed shifted, awkward, as if the chain burned his palm. He took slow steps toward the defense table, each one heavier than the last, and placed the chain before John. It landed with a soft metallic clink, a sound that carried like a sacred thing reclaimed. John didn't reach for it yet, but his fingers twitched, the weight of his father's memory closer now. Sarah's voice filled the room again, steady and unshaken. "This courtroom is not a stage for ego, it is not a playground for power trips, and it is certainly not a platform for racial profiling." The gallery stirred, a woman in the third row whispered, "Amen," her voice soft but fervent. A man in a suit nodded, his jaw clenched, as if seeing justice for the first time. Reed's shoulders tensed, his usual smirk gone, his frame smaller, caught in the mirror of his own action. Sarah continued, her tone measured but piercing. "You acted without cause, violated policy, and degraded a young man in front of this court without justification, without accountability, and without remorse." Gian felt the room shift, the silence breaking into something new. Accountability. A memory surfaced, Sarah, years ago, sitting with him on their Los Angeles porch, explaining justice after a news story about a wrongful arrest. "It's not just about laws, Giotto," she'd said, her voice firm but warm, the chain glinting at his neck as he listened. "It's about truth, and sometimes you have to stand in its way to make it seen. Now she was that stand, her words a shield for him and a reckoning for Reed. Sarah's gaze remained on Reed. Therefore, you are formally barred from participating in further proceedings in this courtroom, pending a full investigation. Gasps broke the silence, sharp but restrained. The court reporter's fingers raced, capturing every word. The prosecutor looked down, his pen still. Reed opened his mouth, but Sarah cut him off, her voice unwavering. I will also submit a complaint to your department's Internal Affairs Division. Request all surveillance footage from this morning for review and follow up personally. The bailiff stepped forward, unprompted, his movement purposeful but calm. Please escort Deputy Reed to the lobby, Sarah said, her tone final. His presence is no longer required or appropriate. Reed hesitated, his boots rooted for a moment too long, his eyes scanning the room as if it had betrayed him. Then he turned, jaw tight, the chain no longer in his hand, his steps heavy on the floor. The gallery watched, not with pity or fear, but with a quiet satisfaction, the kind that comes when justice begins to turn. Whispers spread like a current. A woman in the back murmured, "Did you see his face?" A young man nodded, his eyes wide with awe. John sat straighter, the chain now within reach. Its return a small victory, but a profound one. He felt his mother's strength, not just in her words, but in the love that had shaped him, the same love that had forged the chain through fire. The room was no longer cold. It was alive, charged with the truth Sarah had named. Reed's exit left a void, but it was filled with something greater, a ripple of accountability that would not be contained. The Los Angeles sun had burned away the morning chill by the time John Carter and his grandfather, Abraham Carter, stepped out of the courthouse. The heavy glass doors swinging shut behind them, John's 18 felt the gold chain, his father's scarred relic, back around his neck, its weight both a comfort and a reminder. The raw sting at his throat had dulled, but the memory of Officer Thomas Reed's violation lingered, now tempered by the justice Judge Sarah Carter, his mother, had delivered. Abraham, 76, walked beside him, his cane tapping steadily against the pavement, his fedora tilted just so. The air felt different, not just warmer, but charged, as if the world had taken notice. They hadn't gone far when John felt it. Eyes again, but not the wary glances from the courthouse hallway. These were different, softer, almost reverent. A young man, maybe 20, stood near the courthouse steps, his hoodie faded, his eyes sharp but hesitant. "Hey," he called, stepping closer. John turned, his posture calm but guarded. "You the kid from inside?" the stranger asked. John nodded slowly. The young man glanced around, then lowered his voice. "I saw what happened, that cop, Reed. He's been harassing folks in my neighborhood for years. Stopped my brother last summer, said he fit some description, ended up with a fractured arm." His voice cracked, frustration bleeding through. "Most of us thought we had to stay quiet, avoid him, let it slide. But you didn't. You made them see." John's expression softened, but he stayed silent, the weight of the stranger's words settling deep. The young man gave a quick nod, no fanfare, just truth, then turned and melted into the crowd. John stood still, hands in his pockets, the chain warm against his chest. Behind him, Abraham leaned on his cane, watching. "That boy's right," he said, his voice rough but sure. "You did something today." John glanced at his grandfather, whose eyes were distant, not from absence but from memory. "I had a friend in 73, Abraham said, his voice deepening. "Marcus Tate, smart, worked 2 jobs, sang in church. One night he told an officer he had no reason to be stopped. They broke his jaw, cracked 3 ribs, said he resisted, no witnesses, no tape, just scars." A long silence settled, the city's hume fading around them. "We didn't get justice back then," Abraham said, looking at John. "But you gave us a new ending." John swallowed hard, the weight of his grandfather's words heavier than the chain. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every Marcus Tate, every silenced voice, every scar left unhealed. As they walked toward the car, Jean's phone buzzed faintly in his pocket. He ignored it, but the world hadn't. Someone had recorded the hallway incident. Reed yanking the chain, Jean's stillness, Sarah's words from the bench. The clip, 10 seconds long, no music or narration, hit social media before they reached the sedan. By noon, it was everywhere, shared across platforms with hashtags, Chain of Justice, Not Your Target, His Mother, The Judge. Some posted in anger, others in disbelief, but many in hope. The comments a chorus of voices John would never read but could feel. The video's caption was simple. He didn't know the boy's mother was the judge. It spread like wildfire, each share a ripple from John's quiet stand. A woman in San Diego tweeted, "This is why we fight." A teacher in Houston shared it with her class, sparking a discussion on courage. Jahan didn't see these, but as he and Abraham drove down Sunset Boulevard, the city felt different, as if its pulse had synced with his own. A memory flickered. Jahan, 14, sitting with Abraham after a news story about a protest. "Change doesn't always come loud," Abraham had said, his cane tapping the floor. "Sometimes it's one person standing still, making the world look." Now Jude understood. He hadn't shouted, hadn't fought, but his silence had spoken, and the world was listening. The chain against his chest felt heavier, not with burden but with purpose, a legacy he hadn't chosen but would carry forward. The late afternoon sun filtered through the blinds of the Carter house in Los Angeles, casting slanted rays across the living room's worn wooden floor. The courthouse chaos had faded, reporters gone, cameras packed away, but inside, a quiet weight still lingered. Joan Carter, 18, sat on the edge of the couch, his fingers tracing the gold chain around his neck, its scarred pendant warm against his skin. For the first time since his father Michael died 5 years ago, the chain felt more than a memory. It was armor, forged in fire and reclaimed through truth. Across from him, Judge Sarah Carter, his mother, sat with her robe folded over the armrest, barefoot, her face softened by fatigue but radiant with strength. No bench, no gavel, just her, the woman who'd raised him to stand tall. They hadn't spoken much since returning home. Words weren't always needed between them. Their silence carried years of shared loss and love. But Sarah looked at him now, her eyes soft yet piercing. "You held your ground today, John," she said quietly, her voice a blend of pride and relief. John nodded, a faint smile breaking through. "You did too." Her smile mirrored his, not the polished one she wore in court, but the kind only a mother gives her son when she sees him step into his own strength. John's thoughts drifted to the courthouse, to the moment Sarah's words had shifted the room. "That boy is my son." A memory surfaced. Sarah, years ago, staying up late to teach him how to tie a tie before his first school debate. "It's not just about looking sharp," she'd said, her hands steady as she looped the fabric. "It's about carrying yourself like you belong no matter who's watching." He'd been 12, the chain still new around his neck, his father's absence a fresh wound. Now, that lesson felt like a prophecy fulfilled. He pulled out his phone, opening the Notes app. The blank screen stared back, and after a moment, he typed, "Don't look away again." The words weren't just for him, they were for the gallery who'd stayed silent, for the next kid forced to choose between dignity and survival, for the world that too often turned away. He set the phone down, the chain glinting as he leaned back, its weight a reminder of what he'd carried through that courtroom. A week later, Jones stood at a podium in his school's auditorium, invited to speak at an assembly, not about Reed, not even about his mother, but about courage. The room was packed, students, teachers, counselors, even community members who'd seen the viral video. Jones' hands rested at his sides, no notes needed. "I didn't plan to make a statement," he began, his voice steady, carrying over the silent crowd. "I didn't ask to be part of anything. I just didn't let someone take something from me without reason." He paused, his eyes scanning the room, meeting gazes that held awe, respect, some even tears. That might not sound brave, but sometimes bravery isn't loud. Sometimes it's just not flinching when someone tries to erase you. The applause came, not thunderous but honest, a wave of sound that settled in John's chest. A girl in the front row wiped her eyes, her friend nodding beside her. A teacher in the back stood, clapping slowly, his face a mix of pride and reflection. John felt it, not pride, but purpose, a clarity that this moment was bigger than him. A memory flickered. His father, Michael, after a long shift, sitting with John on their porch, the chain catching the sunset. "You don't have to be the loudest, son," he'd said. "Just be the one who stays true." Jaejon had nodded, not fully understanding. Now he did. As the sun dipped low behind the school, Joan walked out alone, his steps measured, his head high. In his backpack was a notebook he'd started filling that week. Its first page held 5 words. "This time we were seen." He reached for the chain, touching it lightly, then kept walking. The chapter had ended, but the story was just beginning. Sometimes justice doesn't roar. Sometimes it stands still, unshaken, undeniable, refusing to be ignored. Jean's story teaches us that true strength lies in quiet courage, in standing firm when the world tries to erase you. Dignity, not rage, can spark change that echoes beyond a moment. If this moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for joining us at Stories That Matter. Your support keeps these tales alive. Like, comment, subscribe, and tell us. Have you witnessed such courage? Every interaction fuels our mission to honor truth and resilience. See you in the next chapter.